Please welcome back to the stage Secretary Hillary Rodham Clinton.
Hi, how are you?
I'm so glad you're here.
Thank you. Hi, good to see you. Well, if you're not depressed, we'll get you there. I could not be happier to have these extraordinary panelists follow up on the setting of the stage, because now we want to get a little bit deeper and understand the implications for the upcoming U.S. elections. And we have four amazing panelists. Jocelyn Benson is the Secretary of State of Michigan, and she's been in the eye of the storm since, well, before the 2020 election by far, but since then, certainly one of the real leaders to try to understand what was happening. Michael Chertoff, the former Secretary of Homeland Security, co-founder and executive chairman of Chertoff Group, and Michael really has just a depth of experience about dealing with. Originally, it was online radicalization and extremism, and now, of course, based on his knowledge of that set of threats, he understands. We've got to face what's going to happen in the elections. Dara Lindenbaum is the commissioner of the Federal Election Commission of the United States, and as such, she is part of the group that is trying to, make sense of where money is being spent and what's being done with it and the impact that it is having. And Anna Makanju is the Vice President of Global Affairs at OpenAI, and we really are thrilled that she's here with us because clearly OpenAI, along with the other companies, is forging new ground, and a lot of it is very exciting, and frankly, Anna, a lot of it's very concerning. So part of what we want to do is help sort that out, particularly as it does possibly affect elections. So Michael, let me start with you, because as I said, you really were on the front lines when you were at the Department of Homeland Security and leading efforts to understand and prevent the use of the internet at that point to provide outlets for extremism and the radicalization of people. And now I think there's legitimate concern about hostile foreign state actors, not just Russia. There are others who are getting into the game. Why not? It looked like it worked, so join the crowd. But we're now worried that they will use artificial intelligence to interfere in our elections this year. Can you explain for not just our audience here, but the people who are watching the live stream, both the downsides as to how AI can be used by our adversaries, but also what can we do to protect ourselves?
Thank you, and thank you again for leading this, Secretary. So let me say, I think in this day and age, we have to regard the internet and information as a domain of conflict. Actually, if you go back historically, even 100 years, it's always been true that our adversaries have attempted to use propaganda and false information to manipulate us, but the tools they had were relatively primitive. What artificial intelligence has done is equip people to have tools that can be much more effective with respect to the information domain. We've talked a little bit about deep fakes and the ability to have simulated video and audio that looks real. And unlike Photoshop or some of the things some of us remember from years ago, this has gotten to the point that it's very, very difficult, if not impossible, for an ordinary human being to tell the difference. But I would actually argue that artificial intelligence has capabilities and risks that go beyond that. What artificial intelligence allows an information warrior to do is to have very targeted misinformation, and at the same time, and it's not a contradiction, to do that at scale, meaning to do it to hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of people. What do I mean by that? In the old days, again, 10, 20 years ago, if you sent out a message that was incendiary, you affected and positively maybe induced belief by some people but a lot of other people would look at it and go, oh, this is terrible, and it would repel them. So that was an inhibiting factor in terms of how extreme your public statements were. But now, you can send a statement tailored to each individual viewer or listener that appeals only to them, and nobody else is going to see it. Moreover, you may send it under the identity of someone who is known and trusted by the recipient, even though that is also false. So you have the ability to really send a curated message that will not influence others in a negative way. And the reason I say it's at scale, you can do it millions of times, because that's what artificial intelligence does. So I think that has created a much more effective weapon for information warfare. Now, in the context of the election in particular, what are we, I think, worried about? Well, I think obviously one experience we had, and we saw this in 2016 with Russians assisting the Trump campaign, is there can be an effort to skew the votes to a particular candidate or against the candidate. And we've seen that now. We saw that with Macron in France in 2017. We've seen it in the EU and in other parts of the world. But I would actually argue that this year we're facing something that, in my view, is even more dangerous. And that is, it will be an effort to discredit the entire system of elections and democracy. You know, we had a defeated candidate, who I won't mention their name, who has talked about a rigged election. Now imagine that for the people who are an audience for that, they will start to see videos or audios that look like they're persuasively examples of rigged elections. Now it's like pouring gasoline on a fire, and we could have another January 6th. And I understand that the reason our adversaries like this is because more than anything else, they want to undermine our unity of effort and our democracy. And in a world in which we can't trust anything and we can't believe in truth, we can't have a democracy. And that's, I think, going to lead to a third consequence, which will be very dangerous. We're talking about how do you distinguish and teach people to distinguish deep fakes from real things. And the idea being we don't want to have them misled by the deep fakes. But I worry about the reverse. In a world in which people have been told about deep fakes, do they say everything's a deep fake? Therefore, even real evidence of bad behavior has to be dismissed. And then that really gives a license to autocrats and corrupt government leaders to do whatever they want. So how do we help counteract that? Well, I mean, there's some technological tools. For example, there is now an effort to do watermarking of video and audio, where a genuine video or audio, when it's created, has an encrypted mark such that anybody who looks at it can validate that it is real and it's not fake. More than that, we've got to teach people about critical thinking and evaluation so they can cross-check. That when you get a story that appears to stand alone, look to see what are the other stories, is anybody else picking it up? And we need to actually establish trusted voices that are deliberately very careful and very scientific about the way they validate and test things. And finally, I think we've got to teach, even in the schools, and this is going to start with kids, critical thinking and values, what it is that we care about, and why truth matters, why honor matters, why ethics matters, and then to have them bring that into the way they read and look at things that occur online. This is not going to be an easy task, but I do think we need to engage everybody in this process, not just people who are professionals, and make it part of the mandate for civil society over the next year or two.
Thank you so much, Michael. That was incredibly helpful, laying the groundwork for what we need to be thinking about. So, Dara, what is the Federal Election Commission doing to try to set up some of those guardrails on AI-fueled disinformation ahead of the 2024 elections?
Well, thank you for having me, first of all. It's an honor to be a part of this really important discussion. So to your question, the short answer is that the FEC is fairly limited in what it can do in this space, but there is hope on the horizon, and there are different ways that things are developing. So just to lay the baseline, despite the name, the Federal Election Commission really only regulates the campaign finance laws in federal elections, so the money in, money out, and transparency there. But last year we received a petition for rulemaking asking us to essentially clarify that our fraudulent misrepresentation regulations include artificial intelligence and really deep fakes. And we are in the petition process right now to determine if we should amend our regulations, if we can amend our regulations, and is there a role for the FEC in these campaign finance regulations in this space. Our language is pretty clear and very narrow, so even if we can regulate here, it's really only candidate on candidate bad action. So if one candidate does something to another candidate, that is all that we could possibly cover because of our statutes. And that's unless Congress expands that. But all is not lost, and there are some pretty great things that have come out of this, and one is what happened during our petition process. We received thousands of comments from the public and from many other institutional actors, including a lot of the smaller tech companies and organizations that don't often have a seat at the table, but here it was really an open forum for them to bring their ideas to light. These comments were insightful, they were creative, and it is my hope that Congress and states and others looking at this will read all of these comments as they try to come up with possible creative solutions here. And in addition, Congress could expand our limited jurisdiction. If you asked me 3-4 years ago if there was any chance Congress would regulate in the campaign space and really come to a bipartisan agreement, I would have laughed. But it's pretty incredible to watch the widespread fear over what can happen here. We had an oversight hearing recently where members on both sides of the aisle were expressing real concern. And while I don't think anything's going to happen ahead of November, I see changes coming. And there's bipartisan discussion. Senator Klobuchar is leading this, Senator Warner, and they're thinking about ways that they can do something. These are really on the deep fake space. It's not the misinformation, disinformation that's underneath it all, but this discussion of AI and how AI is so at the forefront of everything that we're discussing in this country. I think it has brought more to light this misinformation and disinformation and the ways that the information gets disseminated, that it is bringing that discussion out. So things could change. I'm hopeful.
Well, I really appreciate your talking about that, Dara, because a lot of people say, well, who oversees elections? Who tries to make sure that our elections don't go off the rails and we don't have a lot of these problems? And as you just heard, it's not the Federal Election Commission. Their mandate is narrow, and they try to, make sure people who are contributing to elections have the right to do so, and candidates are spending appropriately. So much of the work about regulating elections is done at the states in our country. And we're so fortunate to have Jocelyn here because, as I said, in introducing her, she really has been at the forefront of trying to figure out how to protect our elections, to make sure they have integrity. And Michigan has recently tried to regulate artificial intelligence. And I want you to tell us about that legislation and any other actions that you are taking on behalf of your state and that other states are taking. But maybe just start, Jocelyn, with just a quick introduction of what you've been facing. You were elected in,
2018.
2018. And, if you remember, pictures of armed men storming the Capitol because they didn't like what the governor was doing about COVID, and Michigan was at the real center of all of the, crazy theories that were put forth in 2020 about the election. Give us just a quick overview, and then tell us about what your regulation intends to do and what else needs to be done.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you, Secretary Clinton, for inviting me to be part of this really important conversation. To me, we cannot protect the security of our elections if we don't take seriously the threat that artificial intelligence poses to our ability as election officials to simply ensure every vote is counted and every voice is heard, and that citizens have confidence in their democracy and in their voice and in their votes. And that's our goal in Michigan and in several other states all around the country. We are coming off of being in the spotlight in 2020, rising to that occasion, but also seeing very clearly and living very clearly when people with guns showed up outside my home in dark night in December, and I'm inside with my 4-year-old son trying to keep us safe. I mean, that's real. And they showed up there just like they showed up at the Capitol on January 6th because they'd been lied to and fed misinformation. And now we're facing an election cycle where those lies will be turbocharged through AI, and we have to empower citizens to stand with us in not being fooled and pushing back on that misinformation and those lies. And therein lies both our opportunity, but also the real challenge. How do we, in a moment where the adversaries to democracy are focused on sowing seeds of doubt, creating confusion and chaos and fear in everything they do, and now have this new emerging technology that is day by day essentially getting stronger and more, you could perhaps say, effective at being poised to accomplishing those goals of creating chaos, confusion, and fear in our democracy and in our voters' minds. How do we respond to that at the state level and throughout our country as citizens by giving each other certainty and confidence that our democracy will stand just as it prevailed in 2020 and every time before and since, but also that we can be equipped, every single one of us, to have clarity as to how to respond when we get this misinformation. So in Michigan, first we set up the guardrails, and several other states have done this too, and we do hope the federal government joins us in banning the intentionally deceptive use of artificial intelligence to confuse people about candidates, their positions, or how to vote, or where to vote, or anything regarding elections. So we've drawn a line in the sand. It's a crime to intentionally disseminate, through the use of AI, deceptive information about our elections. Secondly, we've required the disclaimers and disclosure of any type of information generated by artificial intelligence that's focused on elections. So, for example, one of the things we're worried about is, and we know because of AI, it could be targeted to a citizen on their phone getting a text saying, here's the address of your polling place on election day. Don't go there because there's been a shooting. And stay tuned for more information. That's going to invoke fear. Again, goal is fear, right? It's going to invoke fear in a citizen. With the disclaimer and disclosure in place requirement, that has to be disclosed. This has been generated by artificial intelligence. It's still not sufficient, but it is a key piece of enabling us to push back. But the other side of that is we need to equip that citizen when they receive that text to be fully aware as a critical consumer of information as to what to do, where to go, how to validate it, where are the trusted voices. So in addition to passing these laws, we are setting up voter confidence councils, building out these trusted voices so that faith leaders, business leaders, labor leaders, community leaders, sports leaders, education leaders can be poised, even mayors and local election officials, to be aware and push back with trusted information. And so it's layers upon layers of both legal protections and partnerships to equip our citizens with the tools they need to be critical consumers of information. And then in everything we do between now and in every election, but certainly leading up to November, helping to communicate to every room we're in that it's on all of us to protect each other from the threat of AI in regards to our elections and in many other spaces as well. And while we as officials will be working to do that, we're also trying to communicate to citizens. This is a moment that's going to define our country for years to come, and we all have a responsibility in this moment to making sure we're not fooled, our neighbors aren't fooled, our colleagues and friends aren't fooled, and equipping all of us with the tools we need to push back and speak the truth, value that honor and integrity, and help define our country moving forward based and rooted in those values.
Well, I am a huge fan of what you and your Attorney General and your governor have been doing, and I think it would be great you could get some help to model this. And I'm hoping maybe some tech company or some foundation will talk to you afterwards, because we need to show this can work. I saw Michael nodding his head. I mean, we've got to get, you know, if this is a fight against disinformation, we have to try to put up guardrails, but we also have to flood the zone with the right information to counter the negativity that is out there. So I hope you can implement that, and we can then all learn from it, because it's going to be not a problem that goes away after this election. So Anna, you've been sitting here. You've been sitting through the first panel. Now you've heard our other panelists, and you are, you know, truly at the center of this, because you know, at ChatGPT, you all are moving faster than anybody can even imagine. Sometimes I think probably yourselves about what it is you're creating and the impact that it will have. And this is obviously the ground zero year. This is the year of the biggest elections around the world since the rise of AI technologies like ChatGPT. And so can I ask you, do you agree what you've heard from the panelists about the dangers? But then tell us what you're doing at at OpenAI to try to help safeguard elections. You know, give us your assessment. Are we overstating it? Are we understating it? And what can be done, and how can you help us do it?
So I think what's been really interesting to me listening to your first panel and to my co-panelists here is that so many of the ideas and the concerns we are already integrating into technology. So if I could just say that the one piece of good news is that unlike previous elections, none of us are coming into the, in terms of the tech companies, election officials, even the public and the press, we're not coming into this unprepared. You know, this is especially true for me because I was actually working at the White House on the Russia portfolio in 2016, so this has been top of mind for me from day one in the job. But OpenAI, you know, a relatively young company, this is something that's been top of mind for us for years. In fact, GPT-2, which was several years ago, and you know, quite embarrassing compared to what exists now. At the time, it was state of the art. It could produce paragraphs that were text like a human could write. And even then, we thought, oh, whoa, like the possibility for this to be used to interfere with democracies and electoral process is very significant. And so we made a decision then not to open source it. And it was quite controversial in the research community, but it was because we have this in mind. So, you know, that is, you know, ahead of 2016, we were not having panels like this. And so I think in general, we are much more prepared as a society, and we are working together. You know, OpenAI is working with the National Association of the Secretaries of State and with social media companies, because one key thing to remember is that there is a real distinction. So we are not dealing with the same kinds of issues at AI companies. We are responsible for generating, or what we do is generate AI content rather than distribute it. But we need to be working across that chain. And but in terms of, you know, of course, as many have mentioned here, and as I hear almost in every interaction with policymakers, deepfakes are a very serious concern. And so for us, we have DALL-E, which is an image generator, and we've just banned, you know, we do not allow it to generate images of real people, period, but in particular politicians. And now we are implementing something called C2PA, which is a digital signature. And the great thing about C2PA is that it's not just AI companies. You know, this is the New York Times and Nikon and you know, the BBC. So it's going to be an ecosystem where there's actually a tool across the ecosystem that's going to work to help journalists and social media companies identify if a piece of content is generated by AI. Obviously, this is not, you know, a complete solution, but this is not, you know, this was not the case a year ago, so already we are much more advanced in our ability as, you know, the entire ecosystem to deal with these issues. But we also have, you know, threat investigators. We recently just took down a bunch of state actors who were using our tools. So so these two pieces of cooperation across all of the players and all of the state-of-the-art interventions that we are building I think mean that for right now, the kind of thing that you described, Secretary Chertoff, is not possible with OpenAI tools. You cannot connect them to a chatbot to sort of spew misinformation and target it at voters. But we're constantly evaluating what other kinds of threats does this technology create that are novel. And I would just kind of wrap up with, there is, of course, I do have optimism, otherwise I wouldn't be working at OpenAI. One of the things that these tools have the potential to do is create access to education for new segments of society. And so, there's a potential these tools will actually help create citizenry that is more educated and more aware, which I think is a really key aspect to a healthy democracy. And it can be used, for secretaries of state that are incredibly busy in back offices, and it is a bit of a race between the positive applications of these technologies and negative ones. So I am, this is why it's so fantastic that, for example, the EO by President Biden really works to strike that balance.
Well, we have only a few minutes left, but I just want to ask each of the panelists, what steps can governments, obviously national, state, local in our country, the private sector companies, particularly the tech companies, the AI companies, the platforms, nonprofits, anyone that you think of as to what they could and should do to try to, number one, ensure the integrity of this upcoming election, but then for the longer term, what are the changes we need? Anna, can you start with that?
I think it goes back to what I already mentioned, which is that really close collaboration with AI companies, social media companies, election officials, civil society, really working together to address this problem and sharing best practices and sharing knowledge. Because if this is a whole of society problem, and no single actor is going to be able to be fully effective in solving it.
Dara?
I think the education component and pushing to find trusted sources is key. The technology is going to change. There's going to be new technology in the future. No matter what the government does or what the tech companies do, we need to strengthen the trust that people can build in trusted, forms of news. And I think we're seeing some of that starting to change.
Michael.
I would say, in addition to those suggestions, information sharing. When there is an indication that something is coming that's part of a wave of disinformation, to share information among all the stakeholders, including federal and state and the public, is very, very important. Now, I want to say, I know that there's some litigation now where some states have tried to make it illegal for the government to share information about disinformation with the platforms because they argue that that's censorship. I personally think that's nonsense. I think what you're doing is giving information that's helpful and not doing anything that's harmful.
Yeah, I agree. I think, and particularly for philanthropy and foundations to really invest in entities and partnerships that are focusing on this education and sharing of information and building more collaborative partnerships and teamwork around this. All of that, I think, has to be the foundation for every entity making their first priority protecting citizens from the ways in which AI can be negatively used to harm their own voice and their votes in a democracy, and to recognize that that our adversaries to democracy have figured out how to divide us and demobilize us and deter us from believing in our voice through the use of AI. And so our response needs to be similarly collaborative, national in scope, and focused on empowering citizens and partners all across every arena and sector, tech and beyond, to be a part of the pushback and the protection of our citizenry from this threat to our democracy.
Well, I can't thank the four of you enough, and maybe out of this panel will come that kind of cooperation. Let's try it out. Let's see. Let's get, OpenAI, Facebook, others together with people like Jocelyn and Michael, who have, a lot of depth and what Dara knows from, where the money flows are that she sees. And let's see if there can't be some cooperative effort between now and this election. If we don't try, we know what's going to happen. We know what's going to happen. And I think that, Michael, you made a great point. We need more transparency and openness, and that should be declassifying information as quickly as possible so it gets out in the public. And frankly, governments need to get it out and not ask for permission because it can influence the conversation going forward. But I think this idea of collaboration, it's always better in a democracy to have collaboration, bring people together. So let's see what we can do to follow up. Thank you all very much.